think we're in a war. And I think when you're in a culture war, your goal in a war is to vanquish the enemy. We have tried, and those of us who are fair-minded and reasonable have tried using rational argumentation. We've appealed to the better angels on those on the left. They have dispensed with reason. They have dispensed with rational argumentation. We have students screaming at their professor, says, "How dare you demand that I be logical? How dare you demand that I be reasonable?"
Welcome to The Contrarian. I'm David Bernstein. In a world filled with noise, I'm here to provide the signal. Hi, and welcome to The Contrarian. I'm your host, David Bernstein. Today, we speak with Jason Hill, a professor at DePaul. Jason, really happy to have you with us.
Thank you for having me, David. It's my pleasure.
So you're in Jamaica right now, where you were born.
I am. I'm taking care of my mom, who's ailing, and I was born and raised here, left here when I was 20, 30-something years ago for the States, and I'm back here for a couple of months.
How did a kid who grew up in Jamaica end up a philosophy professor at DePaul?
Well, I was sort of a very precocious child. I was reading Dickens and Austen and all the Victorian novels from I was around the age of 6 and started reading philosophy very early. My father sort of plied me, and my grandfather and my mom plied me with a lot of books very early on. So I decided, I knew my vocational calling from around the age of 9. I was going to be a writer and a philosopher as a teenager, and sort of announced to my mom that we wanted to go, my brother and I, that we really wanted to go to America. So she packed up the whole family with my 72-year-old grandmother, and we came to America. She thought we were too young. And so I put myself through school. She was there to lend moral support and provide a home. And I put myself through school, working up to 3 jobs, before I got a scholarship to do my PhD at Purdue University. I double majored in literature and philosophy. And we got a green card before we left Jamaica. My mom acquired a green card for us through my grandmother, who was an American citizen. And so it was a long, circuitous journey, and took a long time, but finally made it. And I've never looked back. I mean, I'm really grateful to be in what I consider to be the greatest country on earth, America, and to have made something quite substantial of my life.
Yeah. It's interesting, I come from an immigrant mom, and she was shocked when I majored in philosophy in undergrad. You didn't experience it? You weren't pushed toward engineering or something like that?
Oh, I had terrible fights, verbal fights or psychological fights with my mother, who thought I should become a lawyer. And I did. Sure, I took the LSAT. I didn't study for the LSAT. I just took it cold turkey. Got into 25 law school, trashed every one of them, while I had a very high GPA, I think it was 4.0, and couldn't get into any of graduate school's PhD programs for the first year. I was turned down by all of them because it's terribly competitive. My mom said, "You're going to be so poor." And I said, "No, I'm going to write books. I'm going to become a professional philosopher. It's going to happen." And the following year, I got into every single PhD program I applied in, but she thought I should be a lawyer or anything but a philosopher. Once I made a decision, though, and I was very steadfast in my decision to follow my vocational calling, I have to say she and my family, gave me all the support, moral support, because I was very determined. I was intransigent and implacable in my determination to follow through on my calling. And so I got the support that I eventually wanted. Yeah. But yes, there was a lot of pushback. Nobody in Jamaica we didn't study philosophy in Jamaica. I went to an English school, but we did everything but philosophy. So you tell people in Jamaica that you're a philosopher, they say, "You mean a psychologist, right?" And I'm like, "No, I'm a philosopher."
Right. Yeah, that story sounds strikingly familiar. So we're going to get into sort of what's wrong with higher education and what needs to be done to fix it. But I know you have your own personal story about being the subject of cancellation. I'd like to tell us about that. What's happened to you in the recent few years?
Well, I I'm always a contrarian like yourself, David, and I've always been outspoken. Even as a graduate student, I was teaching people like von Mises and Hayek and Ayn Rand and free market thinkers in graduate school, much to the chagrin of my professors. So I've never sort of toed the line, and I've always bucked orthodoxy and received wisdom. So in 2019, I've been working on this 700-page book on the ethical dimensions of American foreign policy, and I had a 70-page chapter on Israel. I've always been pro-Israel. I've always admired Jewish civilization. My grandmother was, for all practical purposes, a Sephardic Jew. Her father was a Sephardic Jew. And he came to Jamaica via Portugal, I believe, and just always admired Jewish civilization, considered it a superior civilization, and had always been an advocate of Israel and a big fan of Prime Minister Netanyahu. And so I wrote this article defending the right of Netanyahu in 2019 when he was on the verge of achieving, I think, his fifth prime ministership, that he had a right to annex Judea and Samaria, what is, I think, improperly called the West Bank. I call it by its proper term, Judea and Samaria. And I said, furthermore, not only did he have a right, but the people there, the Palestinians who vote terrorist organizations into power, like Hamas, like the Palestinian Authority, have no business being allowed to vote. They should be disqualified from voting terrorist organizations into power. That Israel was a beacon of light in a very primitive and dark, and I use the word savage, area in the Middle East amongst a bunch of illiberal nations, and that it was the advanced technological civilization, and that we owed our support to Israel and to give our moral, political, and when necessary, financial support to Israel. And so it went viral within hours of being published. It was published in the Federalist, and the first students I was being stalked in my office, and then students took over an entire building led by that terrorist organization, Students for Justice in Palestine, the SJP, which I must tell people is funded by the AMP and which is funded by Hamas. And I got death threats, and I was subsequently censured by the faculty council, which is a governing body in the university, and then censored by the provost against the orders of the then president, who said, we do not agree with Professor Hill's viewpoint, but it's extramural speech, and he has a right to speak his opinions in his own name. And then a boycott was led against my classes. I was a very popular professor on campus. I had been inducted in the honors program, had received an outstanding teaching award, and was struggling to now fill classes which would normally attract 40 students. There was this faculty-led boycott against my classes, so my classes would have only 2 or 4 students in them. So the battle still continues. I'm pressing on with my lawsuit because I was labeled as a racist, xenophobic, genocidal advocate of all sorts of names, a genocidal, racist, Arab hater. I mean, the slander, the defamation against my character, I've never recovered from it. I'm sort of persona non grata in academia today.
Are your classes starting to fill up again? Has that changed? Has anything changed since that time?
Well, I've pressed on. And so, when you sort of stick things out, as I have, and you don't give up and you don't back down from your positions, they were trying to sort of keep the cultural memory alive. But I've sort of stuck it out, and my classes are filling up again. People who register my classes know who I am. They know my viewpoints because they Google me. So my classes are filling up somewhat again. I have no full classes. But unfortunately, I've been teaching, just lower level classes, not really upper level classes. Like
is that because the dean of your department is sort of boycotting you? I mean, why aren't you getting those other classes?
Well, the graduate students refuse to work with me. They've stated emphatically that they dislike me, that I'm a security threat to their presence. I mean, I used to appear quite regularly on Tucker Carlson, and they would claim that I was complicit with white nationalism and that they feared for their lives. So I don't even have a teaching assistant. And so I'm not even permitted to teach graduate courses because they don't want to work with me at all. So I'm quite happy to work with undergraduates. I love young people, and they're exciting to work with, although they're quite inundated with a lot of the mind viruses that we're going to talk about on your show, what I call the idea pathogens, the woke ideology. But one has to work with them and try to reason with them and present facts to them.
So let's talk about those idea pathogens. How do you see what are they in your view, and where do they come from, and what do you think the trajectory has been? What's your experience of that trajectory? You've been in academia for a while. How has it shifted over time?
Yeah, I've been a professor now for going on 27 years this year, and 24 at DePaul. And, I remember saying when I started out as a professor, because I could see, I had seen the trajectory, that the declinist trajectory in which academia was going in when I started as an undergraduate in the early 90s, late 1980s, early 90s. When Jesse Jackson had joined forces with, I think it was a student at Stanford, and he was saying, if I'm not mistaken, whole Western civils got to go. And the term dead white European males was being bandied around on campus when I was on campus. And it was called DWEMS. And there was this movement to sort of decolonize the content of courses. But it sort of went silent for a while. I still had a rigorous, good undergraduate education and a rigorous analytic education as a PhD student. But the genesis of all this, David, I think goes back to the 1960s, the latter part of the civil rights movement, when we had an infusion of postmodernism and the creation of what I think Bruce Bauer has called them, and I have a chapter in my book, my latest book, What Do White Americans Owe Black People? Victim studies or revolutionary studies, where we had Black studies programs, women's studies, queer studies, gender studies, post-colonial studies, all these victim studies that were really not real disciplines. They were social justice studies that sought to replace scholarship with social activism, that sought to question the foundations on which real scholarship was based, that is reason, logic, evidence, objectivity, and sought to undermine those very concepts, right? Like reason, that there's an objective reality, all the Enlightenment principles on which knowledge really secured its foundation. Those were questioned, and those were seen as constructs of racist, imperialist white males. If you look at the content of Black diasporic studies, queer studies, what you have is something called competing epistemologies or standpoint epistemologies, where every single group, every single identity has its own particular way of knowing, of experiencing the world. And so there is no such thing as universal reason. There's no such thing as an objective reality. It's eternal, it's skepticism, and that they attempt to universally construct a metric or a criteria for adjudicating truth claims is itself racist. So there can be no truth. There can only be no feelings and emoting as ways of arbitrating among truth claims. So it started in the latter part of the 1960s, the dark side of the civil rights movement, I call it, with the eruption of these fake disciplines. And the chickens have now come home to roost. I think around 2015, 16, we saw the rise of transgenderism, and along with movements like the hashtag MeToo movement, we see where the foot soldiers and the buck privates of the 1960s and all the work that they did really, and with the DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, which is sort of like affirmative action steroids, except that it's an intellectual and an ideological movement.
Right.
All a constellation of forces have come into a merger, and we're seeing a kind of what I call systemic nihilism on campus, where coupled with a kind of hardcore left-wing Marxist ideology, which is also being undergirded by foreign funding from a plethora of university of foreign countries, I mean, the breakdown of these countries is amazing, starting with Qatar, which I have a good breakdown here. It gave between 2012 and 2019, $1.5 billion to 28 universities. Saudi Arabia, $650 million to 63 universities. China, $680 million to 87 universities. And it goes down to Russia, Kuwait, even Palestine, which always pleads poverty, gave $1 million to Harvard University, right? With the intention of indoctrinating students, inundating students with certain cultural values, basically to sort of change, I think, David, the cultural, political, and economic DNA of the United States of America.
Yeah, I think that's right.
So these are sort of the what I call the mind pathogens, or the idea pathogens that suffuse our culture and inundate our universities. And with full forethought of malice, our professors and the university bureaucrats are working together, I think, to change the structure, the DNA, the political and the cultural DNA of this country.
Yeah. Yeah, it's almost astounding how successful they've been. You know, there's the long march through institutions, which began in the late 1960s, but there's also a short march through institutions that a term Yashka Monk has coined, which is sort of since 2013, 2014, when they've been able to make tremendous headway, not just in higher education, but now in K through 12 education and other institutions of society. When did this go from being a nuisance to you to being a major threat to your intellectual freedom? When did you really feel that shifting where you saw it as a fundamental threat to our society?
I think in two pivotal moments. And it's sort of like the third iteration of when critical race theory began to infiltrate K through 12. I mean, critical race theory, of course, started in the 1970s under the auspices of Derek Bell.
Yes.
And it remained a sort of it was sort of ensconced in the law schools. And then there was a second iteration in the 1990s under people like Kimberly Crenshaw and so on and so forth. And it still remained in universities. And then the third iteration is when it started infiltrating a couple of years ago in K through 12 institutions, when white students began to be told that they were participants in a systemically racist society just by the color of their skin. And the legatees of these ideas were my college students who started coming to classes and saying to me, I'm giving you like personal anecdotal information here that some of my other colleagues from other universities would say the same thing. Like they would say, Professor Hill, with no disrespect, we're not reading, we can't bring ourselves to read John Locke or John Stuart Mill because these are imperialist racists. John Stuart Mill worked for the East India Company, which was had ties to slavery. And John Locke wrote the South Carolina Constitution. And I had to spend a long time saying, well, where do you get the political vocabulary to have the temerity to tell your professor you're not going to read a text? You are the beneficiary of certain vocabularies that these so-called racist white men bequeath to you. And then I had to go through 20 minutes of explaining to them how to sort of extricate maybe racist opinions from the philosophic system of the thinker. So I think when critical race theory started making itself known, manifesting itself in the K through 12 system, and children, I call them children because they really are children because their conceptual apparatus is really hijacked in a serious way, and they're prevented from thinking critically, came into the classroom armed with a kind of sophisticated rhetoric, unthinking rhetoric about why they can't think, why they can't take the course, or why they shouldn't read the text. And then the second moment, I think, which took all of us by surprise, was the rise of transgenderism, with the mandating of pronouns and the cancellation of misgendering people and the confusion about just stating biological facts. Like I got kicked out of the honors program, I'm sure, because I corrected someone who said that I cannot say that philosophy is the mother of all sciences, as Plato said, because there are people who can have babies that are men. And I just quietly corrected the student and said, well, those are biological women who are called trans men, but have their reproductive apparatus in place. And I was told you can't say that. And so that sort of shuts down a conversation when both critical race theory and woke transgenderism starts infiltrating science. That's when I started to see a real change in the way that pedagogy and discourse and conversations around how material gets taught and scholarship gets formulated began to change.
My question is, you're at a university, you know other professors. What, in your estimation, what percentage of the professors that you encounter either in your philosophy department, I assume that philosophy is slightly less prone to these ideological trends, although I know that they exist in philosophy, but I also have seen more philosophy departments, maybe you'll correct me if I'm wrong, that have resisted these trends. What percentage of your colleagues do you think, even if they're quiet about it publicly, agree with your assessment that this is a very dangerous ideological trend?
Fewer and fewer as time goes by. I think these mind viruses really take over people's minds. And I think because I've seen very, very intelligent people who've said that, for example, they can't define, they don't think it's right to get in the business of defining what a woman is by chromosomal markers, that it's a shifting continuum and that it's nobody's business to sort of define what a woman is. So I think as time goes by, I think the ideopathogens begin to really affect a lot of well-thinking, reasonable people, because they think that we are undergoing a sort of paradigm shift in terms of how social justice is manifesting itself, and they want to be on the right side of history, even if that means willfully evading facts. And they have sort of bought into a narrative that science itself is nothing but an arbitrary social construct. This is the legacy of postmodernism. That is nothing but the product of language games, that is the product of an elite few who have created language games called the scientific method, which consists, among other things, a scientific method that favors an elite group and creates a schemata that oppresses, that has used various mechanisms to oppress marginalized groups. And so you find like woke ideologies really through DEI initiatives is really infecting the field of medicine. So I would say to answer your question, as time advances, I find that more and more reasonable people in the academy are buying into this woke ideology. Let me say something that even before wokeism, or I would call it systemic nihilism, made its presence, I think majority of professors in the humanities and the social sciences were already radical Marxist, postmodern leftists in their sensibilities, who had no love for America, who had no love for capitalism or the free market system, and secretly despised this country. So as early as 2017 or 2018, I believe I wrote an article calling for the defunding and the shutting down of the universities and calling on alumni to start calling for accountability in the classroom, because I'd seen the indoctrination that had been going on for over 2 decades, long before the rise of this sort of more virulent kind of radicalism that we're seeing. I had witnessed it. So I think that going back to the late part of the 1960s and the rise of postmodernism, and not every department is postmodern, but the postmodern sensibility, that is the radical skepticism, the discounting of reason and logic as methods for arbitrating among truth claims or means of acquiring knowledge, reason, was already under assault. The sciences now have become deeply infected by the woke ideology. So My sense is that it's getting a little bit, well, not a little bit, much worse as the activism increases and as the DEI initiatives and the DEI bureaucrats take a larger foothold in our culture. And you can see something like this, David, in like Coca-Cola's mission statement a few years ago on undermining whiteness, right? Where whiteness had come to mean punctuality, individualism, resilience, hard work. And it said, be less white, which means be less resilient, be less individualistic, and so on and so forth. So it spreads from the classroom into the corporate world it's spreading at a much faster rate. The infiltration of ideas from the ivory tower into the real world is happening at a much accelerated rate now.
Yeah. And obviously that's concerning. And we've seen that. I've seen it as well. I've also seen, though, recently a backlash against some of what you're talking about. I know that many corporations are now starting to take a second look at their DEI departments. Zoom, for example, just completely cut its DEI bureaucracy. Mm-hmm. And we're seeing more discussion. I mean, the term DEI, I think, was probably unknown to most Americans. Even 6 months ago. I would bet you if you did public surveys on it, DEI has sort of gone the direction of CRT. CRT is not a popular view in America. It's not a popular concept. And yet, and we did some polling. My organization did some polling on this going back to August 2022. So CRT had very low standing in public opinion, but both anti-racism and DEI still enjoyed support. My theory is that they don't know what it means. They hear the words DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, and they think it is literally what it pretends to be. But but now that it's been exposed in the past few months, especially, I think it might be, I think it might be sliding, and I guess that's my question. I mean, I've been calling this just in the last couple of days a dual narrative, where on the one hand we're seeing the public challenging of these concepts in a much more vigorous way. These university presidents sparked, I think, a public uproar, a much deserved public uproar. And at the same time, the proponents of these ideologies are doubling down. So you're seeing in institutions that have already embraced this, even a fiercer effort to take control of the discourse. But in the larger society, we're starting to see it open up. Do you agree with my assessment that it's going in two different directions at the same time?
Yeah, I think there are two parallel conversations or two parallel responses that are running concurrently. It's just which one is really going to ultimately win out. And I guess I'm of two minds, being in the academy and going around the country a lot, giving talks and giving public lectures, not just talks in universities. And so I think I agree with you that there's more suspicion and that there is more skepticism, especially among parents who are seeing cases in which their rights are being confiscated by school boards and superintendents and high school principals, and their rights are superseded by the rights of teachers' unions, for example, where their kids are being transed and their kids are being gendered, and just the basic parental rights that they have. So there's a lot of pushback. I agree with you, and a lot of these organizations are seeing that it's just not sustainable to have these DEI initiatives because of the kind of mediocrity that it breeds in the long run. At the same time, I do see also the spawning of DEI studies and majors that are coming up in certain universities. And I don't know. The verdict is out, and I'm given pause when I saw Ron DeSantis, who probably ran his campaign too heavily on critical race theory and woke ideology, but people didn't really take him seriously. And I like DeSantis in many respects, and in many respects I don't like him. But I thought that he was onto something when he caught onto the nefarious aspects of critical race theory and woke ideology, really, and people. He just wasn't able to sort of communicate it. I think Chris Rufo did a better job of communicating it to constituents and the larger American public. But I still think that most Americans are not paying sufficient attention to the consequences of these DEI initiatives and of critical race theory. We'll see. The verdict is still out, but I think the universities are not holding back. I mean, the corporations themselves might be because they're guided by profit, and they can't have sustained mediocrity on a protracted level. But because the universities, especially the state universities, are funded by the state, and even the private universities are underwritten by state funding, they can afford, and they're complicit with the board of trustees, or complicit in many of these initiatives. I think they can afford to subvert reality in a way, and because it's a kind of, the whole thing is a kind of magical thinking, right? When you think about the DEI equity, which is calling for equal outcomes from unequal causes, that we're not all equal. We're equal before the law, but we're not equal in virtue and talents and intelligence and athletic prowess and so on. So how can you have equal outcomes when we're not all equal? Unequal outcomes from unequal causes. It's ridiculous. And inclusivity is just inclusion of a certain particular ideological viewpoint. It's not intellectual and diversity. It's a left-wing ideological movement. So I think the universities can have a sort of coercive monopoly on the DEI initiatives in ways that corporations really can't, because they're sort of underwritten by the state in many respects. So
yeah.
I don't know.
Although that's a vulnerability too, isn't it? Isn't it a vulnerability that they're underwritten by the state? Now the state, if it so chooses, and we're seeing several states do this, say, I'm sorry, but we don't want to fund you, and we're going to shut down your bureaucracy. Now that may not be happening everywhere equally, but you see this with a lot of red states, executive orders, legislative initiatives, and so forth. Doesn't that give you some hope that this could be turned around?
Well, this is one of my solutions, David. I think that aside from shutting down the universities, state universities, and defunding them, I would go as far as saying that, and I speak as a conservative independent, not affiliated with any party, Republican or Democrat. I vote independently, but I think that this administration, the Democratic administration, is so complicit with the DEI initiatives. I mean, you can, if you want a definition of DEI, just ostensibly point to Joe Biden and his administration, right? So one of the solutions I would have, and it's pretty radical, is I would advocate that at least the state universities be placed in, that U.S. legislators, Republican U.S. the U.S. legislative bodies of Republicans, place some of these universities in receivership. Because I think it's only when they are broken down and rebuilt with true intellectual diversity, which the left is never going to do, when we do have something like a quota system where you have sociology departments and philosophy departments and history departments and political department, science departments, with something like a fairness doctrine, where you have a certain percentage represented by conservatives and liberals or people on the left, that we're going to see a return, or we will see something like what a true liberal arts education looks like.
Yeah.
So,
but that sounds like viewpoint affirmative action. I actually used that phrase with somebody else. By the way, I'm not opposed to it. I think it has to be done, but I think it's an interesting irony that it sounds very much like what we used to call affirmative action. We're trying to make up for some past inequities, so we're going to give preferences to certain people. In that case, race. Now on viewpoint, just to reverse some of these trends. What do you think of that formulation?
Well, I think we're in a war. I think we're in a culture war. And I think when you're in a culture war, your goal in a war is to vanquish the enemy. And I think that we have tried, and those of us who are fair-minded and reasonable have tried using rational argumentation. We've appealed to the better angels on those on the left. And they have they have dispensed with reason. They have dispensed with rational argumentation. We have students screaming at their professor, says, "How dare you demand that I be logical? How dare you demand that I be reasonable?" When you're dealing with the lowest common denominator in people, when you're dealing with people who have dispensed with their rational faculty, which is what, according to Aristotle, and I agree with him, makes us human. When you're dealing with people who deliberately start a culture war and intend to impose, mandate their cultural mores and norms on the rest of society, then you've got to fight in another manner. And if viewpoint affirmative action is one such method of squashing and vanquishing the enemy, then that's one method of fighting that we've got to resort to. I think people have to realize that in a cultural war, we are in a culture war. Bridge thinking and bridge thinkers, that sort of enterprise. I have someone who said to me, why have you given up being a bridge thinker? And I said, because the other side has blown up the bridge, and we didn't blow it up. They blew it up with their cultural warfare, with their mandates, by indoctrinating, by using the university as an indoctrination center, a site of indoctrination, by punishing students who hold contrarian viewpoints. So the cultural war was not started by conservatives or people on the right. The cultural war was started by the far left, who took over the universities beginning, I think, in the 1960s, and have never let go of their coercive monopoly on their cultural wars. So I think, yes, it might be a form of viewpoint affirmative action, but that's the least that one can do in a cultural war. And the cultural war has to be won if the republic is to be saved. So I say, if we can use any methods short, of course, of physical violence, nobody's advocating that, but if we can use the tactics that our adversaries have been using for decades now as a means of defeating them, then why not? Because we've tried the fear. We've used the just war theory, the equivalent of the just war theory, intellectually, and it hasn't worked.
So you're talking about Dresden here. I knew, Jason, that I brought you on for a purpose. You're my nuclear option in this discussion. Now, let me go back to just war theory for a minute, okay? There are some experiments that are being done in certain universities. Center for Civic Conversation. I call them centers for open inquiry. We're seeing one at Yale Law School in the process of being established. There's one at University of North Carolina. My understanding is there's one at Arizona State University. I'm looking into them. I'm very curious about them. And the theory is that if you can get these things established within the existing university system or university campus, they'll over time attract the best and the brightest. So people like you will say, I'm done being in this coercive environment. I'm going to go teach at one of these centers for open inquiry. And there's a lot of you, by the way. I know that they're hard to come by, but all you have to do is dig a little and you realize that there's hundreds of professors who are actually quite unhappy with the current situation. Those people will be attracted to these centers of open inquiry. They'll also attract superior student talent as well. And over time, they will become a magnet for the best and the brightest and will eclipse these more radical victim studies departments. What is your take on that? Do you think that offers some hope?
No, because I think unless you get rid of the current administration, the provosts, the presidents, the associate provosts, the executive associate provost, the bloated totalitarian bureaucracy, which is, by the way, is responsible for the tremendous hike in tuition fees, right? It's the deans, and every dean has an associate dean, and every associate dean has an executive and assistant that earns up to $300,000 and $400,000. Unless you get rid, and they're the ones who sort of, make the decolonialist and the postmodernist lines and the Marxist lines available. I would say the universities are so corrupt, are so inundated with these fascists, and they are fascists, these DEI fascists, these woke nihilist fascists, that these small centers are I don't know that they stand a chance against the larger bureaucracies, including boards of trustees, the board of trustees, I should say, of various universities. I think we've got to tear down, we've got to pull a Nagasaki, a Hiroshima, and a Dresden combined on these universities. Just bomb them all to hell, get rid of them, shut them down, defund them, and then start from scratch. Start from
but that might not happen anytime soon, Jason. It's like, that's my look. I hear you, and if I could wage a magic wand, I'd want the universities completely transformed. And I agree with your concern that these departments will become corrupted by the intellectual environments and the institutional environments that they're in. I think that's a completely legit concern. Maybe it's even a probability. I don't know. But there's a part of me that says, okay, let's try a bunch of things at once. Let's do the Centers for Open Inquiry. Let's start the University of Austin, Texas. Let's try to see if a group of billionaires, as some have suggested, should take over or should find allies within a certain university and try to restructure that entire university. Let's also, I don't know, maybe try the nuclear option in a few places and see if it works. And let the chips fall where they may. Maybe that's the best we can do.
I think so. I think that's right, David. I don't think there's a sort of like a single metric. I think in what I call in the moral division of labor, I think there are many fights that can occur on multiple levels or multi-tiered fighting. And I think to think that just the sort of Dresden Nagasaki, to use a metaphor, method is the only way is simple-minded. That's one method. But I agree with you that we can go the Ralston College way. We can go, that's a college in Savannah, the old-fashioned college. We can go the University of Austin in Texas. We can go multiple roads and at the same time. And as you said, let the chips fall where they may. And also, we have to let people fight battles that they are well suited for fighting. Like, not everybody is going to be as combative and as contrarian as I am. Some people are I'm not an administrator, so some people are better suited for setting up universities. And Jordan Peterson, for example, who's both a contrarian and he's setting up an academy, more power to him. And then there are people who are more like thought leaders and are out there to sort of like make people aware that you've got to have the courage of your convictions. You've got to stick around. Like I'm still at DePaul and I'm still fighting the good fight, and not cower with your tail between your legs and run away, but stand up to those bullies or administrators. And when they tell you, like they've told me, do not write any more controversial articles, especially about Israel, flick them off and write 7 more or write 8 more and have the courage of your convictions. So I think you're right that battles have to be fought on multiple levels. And it's the convergence of these warriors, these soldiers, fighting battles on multiple levels that brings about, I won't use the term revolution because that would be appropriating the language that the radical left uses, but a real transformation in the best sense of that term that will occur.
Yeah, there's a sociological concept called simultaneity when multiple things happen at once in different ways that you can get massive and quick social change. Let's talk about DEI for a second. I think we both agree that the form of DEI that's taken over in universities and many other segments of society is quite toxic and reinforces all the ideological trends that you're seeing at universities that started well before DEI took shape. There is a school of thought that says, look, DEI, like universities themselves, this is sort of a critique of maybe your point, what's politically possible, is not going to go away because we wish it away. And particularly in blue states, maybe in red states, we can get away with that. But in blue states, we're going to have to actually try to transform DEI. Ibu Patel, who's a Muslim interfaith leader, was interviewed by David Brooks in the New York Times, and he suggested, okay, let's change the model. Let's make it more pluralistic. Let's hire, instead of the chief diversity officer, the chief cooperation officer, and flip the paradigm on its head. Another form of this that I've seen was was Danielle Allen. She's a African-American political philosopher at Harvard who wrote a piece recently in the Washington Post about her 2018 experience at Harvard, where they tried to adopt an alternative form of DEI that included viewpoint diversity and religious diversity. And ultimately they failed because of the George Floyd moment and so forth. But, it shows that obviously there are people who would do it differently if allowed to. Is that a possibility that we could see a liberal form of DEI that, maybe you and I would still be mildly critical of in some ways, but wouldn't be the ideological reinforcer in that it is today? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, my thoughts are that it's just the whole thing is superfluous, because since the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Act and the 1972 Employment Act, we have seen the erosion of systemic racism in this country. That's a topic of my last book. What do white Americans owe Black people? Racial justice in a post-oppressive society. And I think any kind of DEI initiative is parasitic or presupposes that we still live in a systemically racist society. Not that there's not racism, but the idea that racism systemically suffuses institutions, which means that there are laws or mores or norms that systemically suffuse institutions that with full forethought of malice or with intend to block out Blacks, or the minorities. And the opposite is quite the contrary is the case. I mean, I work in the university system. If you are a Black male, and Black males are considered endangered species, with a C+ average or a B average, let's say a B average, B-, there is no college that will not send a jet plane for you and fly you, put you up in the best hotel and recruit you, right? If you're a trans, God help, if you're a trans Black person, you're like an exotic bird, an exotic creature. You are coveted. Corporations are going out of their ways on their own to diversify their employment pool, because it's in their interest to have a diversified skilled labor pool, right? We don't, David, we don't have enough PhDs, American-born PhDs to fill, or American-born computer scientists to fill our PhD programs, right? So it's in the interest of America to have properly vetted immigrants to fill our PhD programs. So I think the whole thing is superfluous, and I'm really suspicious of what a sort of liberal DEI initiative looks like, stripped of any kind of ideological connotations to it. Equity is a nefarious term.
Right.
Because
but you could redefine it, right? We could just say, well, we don't mean by it in the Ibrahim X. Kendi sense. We basically go back to equality of opportunity. Like you could come up with a DEI that replaced the word equity with equality.
Well, let's call it equality and let's stick with equality and get rid of equity. But what people have to realize is that equality and equity are two very, very different things. And that diversity here does not mean diversity of intellectual thought. It means diversity with racial quotas in mind. It means diversity that comes with discrimination against white males. It means diversity with a preference for hiring a multiplicity of people of color. And that inclusion does not, same thing with inclusion. So it is properly speaking a form of reverse racism, or just racism simpliciter. And I don't know what a liberal version of that would do. We've already had affirmative action. That's why I said some people would call it affirmative action steroids, but at least affirmative action came on the heels of the end of Jim Crow.
Yeah.
And I favored affirmative action in the early phases. I said, America had an ugly past, and the state was complicit in creating racist Americans. And so there was an expiration date that should have been affixed to affirmative action, but we did need some sort of corrective measure to get America in the right. It was kind of a eugenical program, if you want to look at it. I call it that way in my book. But now we're going into the realm of really trespassing on individual rights and into a form of discrimination that I think is inimical to the meaning of a constitutional republic. So I would have to say no. I would say scrap DEI initiatives are, when you analyze them, when you look at them empirically and what they actually mean, are quite pernicious and have no truck in a free constitutional republic that already has affirmative action programs on the book and that already, under the 1964 Civil Rights Act, outlaws and illegalizes racism.
Got you. Yeah, well, it's interesting. I might differ with you a little bit. I think you could fashion, and there are some models of what you might not even call them DEI, by the way. I think there's an argument that they're not actually DEI, but there's the Moral Courage College, which teaches something very different that has been called a liberal form of DEI. But like the issue of how you reform a university, you might want multiple approaches at the same time. It's a tall order in a blue state to go from having DEI be this huge established bureaucracy with, like in the case of University of Michigan, $30 million budgets, and to make it go away overnight. If the University of Michigan said, we're going to do away with our current bureaucracy, DEI bureaucracy, and try something completely different, I'd probably welcome it with open arms. Suspicious, though, that it might not work and that it would be sucked into the same vortex that all other forms of open inquiry are in these university environments. But again, willing to try almost anything. But I think that I'm glad that we had this conversation. I'm glad that you brought up these sort of more severe interventions. I think we need to have we have to open up the conversation in its entirely. And, would I be upset if a single governor, single state puts its university in receivership as a model of how to deal with this? No, I'd like to see that happen. Maybe more than a single, maybe in a few, and watch what happens and how that affects the entire system. But I do think we're at a time when these conversations are happening more and more. Boards of trustees who have probably been silent for the most part are now starting to, some cases, speak out against the illiberal environments that they've helped unleash on their own campuses. By the way, they should properly be viewed as complicit in all this. So I do think it's an amazing opportunity to open up this conversation, to strategize with people like you, and I hope to do more of that in the coming weeks. And I really appreciate your openness and candor and your courage in fighting the good fight on your own university and in your books and your writing and your thinking, and not going. We just need more and more of you. And so I thank you for doing what you do and for putting yourself on the firing line.
Thank you, David. Can I just say one more thing?
Sure, please.
Just to end, I want to end on a sort of positive note. I think a lot of these, when we talk about foreign funding of universities and these DI initiatives, they come with a sort of manifest destiny. That is a sort of idea that these foreign countries and that these DI and woke ideologists have as their end goal. And I think we as Americans have got to sort of figure out what is our new manifest destiny. How do we rebrand ourselves in the face of assaults on the integrity of our great republic? There's a new rebranding. We have to ask ourselves, what is going to be our new manifest destiny? Not in the old sense of manifest destiny in the 19th century, as it was coined in 1864 by O'Sullivan. But how do we rebrand ourselves against all the assaults against integrity levied against our great republic? And that's a question that we need to think about as we start thinking about the universities, which are the transmission belts of culture in our society. What is our manifest destiny? Where do we want to go? How do we keep our republic? And if we really keep that question in mind as Americans, one people united, under one nation, I think we'll have a sort of moral clarity when it comes to thinking more comprehensively, and not just as retailers in the realm of cognition, but as wholesalers when it comes to achieving moral clarity about thinking in terms of solutions. If we think in terms of how do we rebrand our identities as Americans, not as just sort of these having these tribal factional identities as groups, but as Americans first and foremost.
Yeah. I've been talking about a new American pluralism, which I think really is very similar, or maybe a patriotic pluralism, like
Yes.
where we, we're proud of our diversity, our ethnic diversity, our viewpoint diversity, but we also do so as Americans and proud Americans. And I noticed, by the way, the shift in discourse, even among progressives. Like if you go back to like the TV shows of the 1980s, as I just recently did, my wife was watching old episodes of the Golden Girls. And that was a quote unquote progressive, politically progressive for its time TV show. Yet I was listening to one of the key characters talk openly about her love of America. And I thought, wow, that is quaint.
Yes.
And I think we need some version of that now. It's, among, by the way, the far right too, which I think has lost its moorings in patriotic discourse too. And we need to reinvent ourselves as Americans. So I might have you back on again to explore that, because I'm going through I'm going through higher education now, and I'm doing a series on higher education, but I'd like to go back and talk about what a new American pluralism looks like. And so I'm going to have you back on, I hope, with your cooperation in the future.
I'd love to. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks so much, Jason Hill. Glad to have you on. Thank you for tuning in to The Contrarian. If you enjoyed the show, be sure to give us a thumbs up and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Don't forget to rate our podcast on Apple and Spotify. Stay connected with us on social media for more updates. Until next time, keep challenging.